I was standing on my front lawn watching the electrician scratch his head when I realized that Brenda, the HOA president, had actually gone through with her insane threat. My house sat dark and silent on December 15th in Phoenix, Arizona, while every other home on Saguaro Ridge Drive glowed with festive warmth. The electrician, a weathered guy named Tom who'd seen everything in his 40 years doing residential work, kept looking between my main breaker box and the street panel like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Someone physically cut the main line," Tom said, pointing at the junction box near the street. "This wasn't an accident or a power surge. Somebody took wire cutters and deliberately severed your connection to the grid." My stomach dropped. I'd spent $3,000 on my holiday light display this year, transforming my modest ranch house into what the local news had called a winter wonderland in the desert. Synchronized LED lights danced a holiday music broadcast on a low-power FM transmitter. I had 12-foot inflatable snowmen, a life-sized nativity scene, candy cane pathway lights, and a spectacular rooftop display featuring Santa's sleigh with 8 reindeer. Kids from all over Phoenix had been driving by with their parents every evening for the past week. "Can you fix it?" I asked. Tom sucked air through his teeth. "I can, but here's the thing, Mr. Yates. Whoever did this committed a serious crime. Tampering with electrical infrastructure isn't just illegal, it's dangerous. You need to call the police before I touch anything." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. Within 20 minutes, 2 Phoenix PD officers arrived, followed shortly by someone from the city's electrical department. The city inspector, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia, took one look at the cut wires and immediately radioed for a supervisor. "This is a felony," she said flatly. "Criminal damage to utility infrastructure. Arizona Revised Statute 13-1602. Could carry up to 2 years in prison depending on the circumstances." Officer Rodriguez, the senior of the 2 cops, started taking photographs. "Walk me through what happened, Mr. Yates." I explained how it all started. 3 weeks ago, right after Thanksgiving, I'd begun setting up my display. I'd always loved Christmas lights, probably because my dad had been the same way when I was growing up in Flagstaff. This was my first Christmas in this particular neighborhood after my divorce, and I'd wanted to do something special, something that would spread joy and maybe help me feel less alone in this new chapter of my life. The display had been up for 5 days when I received my first letter from the HOA. It was printed on cream-colored letterstock with the Saguaro Ridge Homeowners Association letterhead, signed by Brenda Hutchison, HOA president. The letter stated that my display exceeded the community guidelines for exterior decorations by creating excessive light pollution and visual disturbance that negatively impacted the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. I'd read through my HOA bylaws that night, all 73 pages of them. Nowhere did I find specific wattage limits or brightness restrictions for holiday decorations. The only relevant clause stated that decorations should be tasteful and in keeping with the community standards, which was about as vague as you could get. The next day, I'd gone to Brenda's house to discuss it. She lived 4 doors down in a house that looked like it had been decorated by someone who thought beige was too exciting. Her yard was meticulously maintained with desert landscaping that probably violated some natural law about being too boring to exist. When she answered the door, she'd looked at me like I'd tracked dog waste onto her pristine concrete porch. "Mr. Yates," she'd said, not inviting me inside. "I assume you received our letter." I did, and I wanted to talk about it. I checked the bylaws and I don't see how my display violates anything specific. Her lips had pursed into a thin line. Brenda was maybe 55, with hair dyed an aggressive shade of auburn and the kind of permanent scowl that suggested she'd been filing complaints since the womb. The spirit of the guidelines is clear. Your display is garish and excessive. Several neighbors have complained about the brightness affecting their sleep. Several neighbors, that's confidential. Well, I've had at least 20 people stop by to tell me how much they love it, kids especially. This is a quiet, upscale community, Mr. Yates. We have standards. I'm going to have to ask you to reduce your display by at least 75%. And if I don't, her eyes had gone cold, then we'll be forced to take action. We have the authority to impose fines, and if necessary, we can take steps to ensure compliance. I'd walked away from that conversation angry but not particularly worried. HOAs could be annoying, but I'd paid my dues, kept my lawn maintained, and painted my house an approved color. My Christmas lights weren't hurting anyone. The second letter arrived a week later. This one threatened daily fines of $250 if I didn't comply within 72 hours. I'd consulted with a lawyer friend, Marcus, who'd laughed and told me the HOA was overreaching. He'd helped me draft a response letter citing the vague bylaws and requesting a formal hearing before the HOA board, which was my right according to the governing documents. Brenda hadn't liked that. She'd shown up at my door the next evening, this time with 2 other board members in tow, Gerald Peck, the vice president, and Linda Morrison, the secretary. Gerald was a retired accountant who looked like he'd spent his whole life searching for receipts to audit. Linda seemed nervous, like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Yates, we're here to conduct a compliance inspection," Brenda had announced. "You have an appointment. We don't need one." Section 14, subsection C of the bylaws grants the board the right to inspect properties for compliance purposes. I'd actually read that section. With 24 hours written notice, which you haven't provided. Brenda's face had flushed red. "You're being deliberately difficult." "I'm being accurate. Look, I'm happy to discuss this reasonably, but I'm not taking down my lights. They're not violating any specific rule, they're making people happy, and frankly, this feels like a power trip." That's when Brenda had stepped closer, her voice dropping to something that sounded almost like a threat. "You're new to this neighborhood, so let me explain how things work here. I've been president of this HOA for 12 years. I maintain order and property values. People who fight me end up very, very sorry. Take down the lights, Mr. Yates, or you'll regret it." Gerald and Linda had looked uncomfortable, but neither of them contradicted her. They'd left, and I'd immediately emailed my lawyer friend about the encounter. 3 days later, someone had slashed 2 of my inflatable decorations. I'd filed a police report, but without security cameras, there wasn't much they could do. I'd replaced the inflatables and installed cameras, mounting them discreetly on my eaves. Then yesterday, I'd received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, threatening legal action and placing a lien on my property if I didn't comply immediately. The letter claimed I was in violation of sections that, when I looked them up, didn't actually apply to holiday decorations at all. They were grasping at straws, but a lien on my property would complicate my life significantly. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, which was scheduled for tonight, December 15th. To address this in person before the entire board and any other homeowners who wanted to attend. Except this morning I'd woken up to no power. Everything was dead. No refrigerator, no heat, no lights, nothing. I checked my breaker box first, thinking maybe something had tripped. Everything looked fine. That's when I'd called the power company, and they'd told me my home was showing as disconnected from the grid. They'd sent Tom out to investigate. Now, standing in my dark yard with police officers and a city electrical inspector documenting what was clearly a crime, I felt a strange mixture of anger and vindication. Brenda had actually done it. She'd gone so far over the line that she'd committed a serious felony. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Officer Rodriguez asked. I explained the entire situation with Brenda and the HOA. His partner, Officer Chen, raised her eyebrows. "That's quite an escalation," she said, "but we'll need proof connecting her to this specific act." "I have cameras," I said, remembering. "I installed them last week after someone vandalized my decorations." We went to my truck, where I'd been charging my phone and iPad off the 12-volt outlet. I pulled up the camera app, grateful I'd sprung for cameras with cloud storage. I scrolled back through the footage from last night. At 2:30 in the morning, a figure in dark clothing appeared on camera, walking quickly down the sidewalk. The person wore a hoodie and kept their head down, but they walked straight to my junction box on the street. They'd looked around, produced what looked like wire cutters from a pocket, and opened the junction box. The entire act took less than 3 minutes. "Can you send us that footage?" Officer Rodriguez asked. "Absolutely. But watch this." I zoomed in on a frame where the person had turned slightly toward the street, probably checking for cars. The streetlight caught their face partially. It wasn't Brenda. It was Gerald Peck, the HOA vice president. Officer Chen leaned in. "You're sure that's him? I've met with him twice." "That's definitely Gerald Peck. He lives at 4521 Saguaro Ridge Drive." The officers exchanged glances. "All right, Mr. Yates. We're going to have a conversation with Mr. Peck. In the meantime, the city inspector needs to make the scene safe, and then your electrician can restore your power." Patricia, the city inspector, was already on her phone coordinating with her supervisor. "We're treating this as a crime scene for now. Once we've documented everything, I'll authorize the repair. Given the circumstances, the city will waive any permit fees for the restoration work." Tom started preparing his equipment. "Once I get the green light, I'll have you back up and running in about an hour." I thanked everyone and watched as Officers Rodriguez and Chen drove off, presumably toward Gerald's house. The next 2 hours passed in a strange blur. Patricia and her supervisor took detailed photographs and measurements. Tom worked on safely capping the cut wires and preparing new connections. Neighbors started emerging from their houses, curious about the police presence and the city vehicles. My next-door neighbor, an elderly woman named Dorothy, came over with a thermos of coffee. "What's happened, Jason? Is everything all right?" I explained the situation. Dorothy's eyes went wide. "That's terrible. I absolutely love your decorations. My grandchildren ask me to drive them by every night. Brenda Hutchison did this, her vice president apparently, at her direction, I'm guessing." Dorothy shook her head. "That woman is a menace. Last year she tried to fine me because my agave plant was supposedly 3 inches over the height limit. 3 inches. I had to get a surveyor out here to prove she was wrong." Other neighbors started gathering. Word spread quickly. By the time Tom reconnected my power and my house blazed back to life, including the Christmas display, I had a small crowd of supporters on my lawn. Several people were taking photos and posting on social media. Someone had already created a hashtag, Save Jason's Lights. My phone rang. It was Officer Rodriguez. "Mr. Yates, wanted to update you. We made contact with Gerald Peck at his residence. He initially denied any involvement, but when we showed him stills from your security footage, he broke down pretty quickly. He's been arrested and charged with criminal damage to utility infrastructure. criminal trespassing, and a few other charges. He's claiming he did it on his own initiative, but he did admit the HOA president had been pressuring the board to take action against your display. Is Brenda going to be charged? That's still under investigation. We need to establish what she knew and whether she directed him to commit this specific act. We've got detectives who will be looking into it. In the meantime, you might want to beef up your security. After he hung up, I stood in my yard watching my lights dance through their programmed sequence. The sun was setting, and the display looked spectacular against the darkening sky. Cars were already slowing down to look. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, my lawyer friend. Saw the news. We need to talk. You've got grounds for a major lawsuit against the HOA. Also possible criminal charges for Brenda if they can prove conspiracy. The HOA meeting was supposed to start in 2 hours. I decided I was definitely going to attend. I grabbed a quick shower in my now functioning bathroom, changed into clean clothes, and made myself a sandwich since my refrigerator was working again. At 7:30, I drove the half-mile to the community center where HOA meetings were held. The parking lot was packed. I'd never seen so many cars at an HOA meeting before. Apparently, word had spread not just about the power-cutting incident, but about the entire conflict. I recognized people from the neighborhood, but there were also faces I didn't know, probably from other nearby communities who'd heard about the situation on social media. Inside, the meeting room was standing room only. The Phoenix Area News had even sent a reporter and camera crew. Brenda sat at the front table with Linda Morrison. Gerald's seat was conspicuously empty. Brenda's face was tight, her jaw clenched. She avoided making eye contact with anyone. At exactly 8 o'clock, Brenda called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. Due to the unusual attendance tonight, I want to remind everyone that only homeowners in good standing may speak during the meeting. Any outbursts or disruptions will result in immediate removal. A hand shot up in the 3rd row. It was Dorothy. Point of order, Madam President. Given that one of your board members was arrested today for committing a felony against another homeowner in this community, don't you think it's appropriate to address that situation first? The room erupted in agreement. Brenda's face went from red to purple. That is not on tonight's agenda. Then I moved to amend the agenda. A man I recognized as living 2 streets over called out. We need to discuss what happened to Jason Yates and what the board's involvement was. I second that motion, Dorothy said. Brenda looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Fine. We can discuss the incident, but let me be clear. Gerald Peck acted alone and without board knowledge or approval. His actions do not represent this HOA or its leadership. That's not what Gerald told the police, I said, standing up. Every head in the room turned toward me. The news camera swung in my direction. Brenda's eyes blazed. You have not been recognized to speak, Mr. Yates. Then I'd like to be recognized. This is not the public comment portion of the meeting. A voice from the back shouted, let him speak. Others joined in. Linda Morrison leaned over and whispered something to Brenda. The HOA president looked like she'd swallowed glass, but she nodded stiffly. Mr. Yates, you have 3 minutes. I walked to the front of the room. Thank you. As most of you know, I woke up this morning with no electrical power because Gerald Peck cut the main line to my house. This happened after weeks of harassment from the HOA about my Christmas decorations, which violate no specific bylaw or regulation. I've received threatening letters, been subjected to intimidation, and had my property vandalized. When I tried to address these concerns through proper channels, requesting a formal hearing as is my right, the situation escalated to criminal activity. I looked directly at Brenda. Gerald Peck told the police that the HOA president, that's you, Brenda, had been pressuring the board to take action against my display. I want to know exactly what you meant by that phrase and whether you had any knowledge that Gerald was planning to commit a felony. The room was dead silent. The news camera was definitely recording. Brenda's hands were shaking. I never directed anyone to commit a crime. The board discussed legal options for enforcing our community standards. That's all. What legal options? I pressed. Because cutting someone's power isn't a legal option. Neither is vandalizing their property. Neither is threatening them on their doorstep, which you did to me personally. You told me, and I quote, "People who fight me end up very, very sorry." Brenda stood up abruptly. I don't have to listen to these baseless accusations. Sit down, Brenda. The voice came from a distinguished-looking man in his 60s sitting in the front row. I recognized him as Richard Harper, who lived in one of the larger homes on the ridge. Jason isn't finished, and we all want to hear what he has to say. Brenda remained standing. I'm the president of this board, and I won't be spoken to this way. Actually, Linda Morrison said quietly, I'd also like to hear the rest of what Jason has to say. Please sit down. Brenda slowly sank back into her chair. I continued. I've lived here for 8 months. I've paid my dues, followed the rules, and tried to be a good neighbor. I put up Christmas lights because it brings me joy and because it makes other people happy. Kids love it. Families drive by every night. I've had dozens of people thank me personally. But because Brenda decided my lights didn't match her vision of what this neighborhood should look like, she's made my life hell. And now someone's been arrested for a felony that carries up to 2 years in prison. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app. I have every letter the HOA sent me, every email and security footage of Brenda standing on my porch making threats. I also have footage of Gerald cutting my power line. The police have copies of everything. I've also consulted with an attorney about filing a civil lawsuit against the HOA and its board members personally for harassment, intimidation, and emotional distress. The room exploded into conversation. Multiple people started shouting questions at Brenda. The news reporter was speaking urgently into her microphone. Linda Morrison had her head in her hands. Richard Harper stood up. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in Brenda Hutchison as HOA president. Seconded. At least 5 people shouted simultaneously. Brenda grabbed her gavel and started banging it frantically. This is improper procedure. You can't just... Section 21 of the bylaws, Richard said calmly. Any board member can be removed by a 2/3 vote of homeowners present at a properly noticed meeting. This is a properly noticed meeting. Let's vote. Linda Morrison looked at Brenda. He's right. Those are the rules. All in favor of removing Brenda Hutchison as HOA president, raise your hands, Richard called out. A forest of hands shot up. I counted quickly. Out of maybe 70 people in the room, at least 60 had their hands raised. Opposed, 3 hands, including Brenda's own. The motion carries. Brenda, you're removed as president effective immediately. I'd also recommend you resign from the board entirely before this gets any uglier. Brenda stood there, trembling with rage and humiliation. The news camera captured every second. Finally, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the room, nearly knocking over a chair in the process. The room buzzed with energy. Linda Morrison looked relieved and terrified at the same time. Richard Harper addressed the room. I propose we hold emergency elections for a new president at a special meeting next week. In the meantime, Linda, you're the acting president as senior remaining board member. Your first order of business should be to issue a formal apology to Jason Yates and to rescind all fines and threats related to his holiday decorations. Linda nodded quickly. Absolutely. Jason, on behalf of the HOA, I sincerely apologize for everything you've been put through. Your decorations are beautiful, and you're welcome to keep them up as long as you'd like. We'll be reviewing our decoration guidelines to make them more specific and reasonable. The meeting continued for another hour. People nominated new candidates for the board. There was discussion about how to prevent future abuses of power. Several people shared their own stories of Brenda's petty tyranny over the years. By the time the meeting ended at 10:30, the mood had completely shifted from angry to almost celebratory. As I was leaving, the news reporter caught up with me. "Mr. Yates, can I get a statement for our 11 o'clock broadcast?" I thought about it. "Sure. I just want to say that I never intended for any of this to become such a big deal. I just wanted to put up some Christmas lights." But what happened to me is a reminder that people in positions of power, even small power like an HOA board, need to be held accountable. When someone abuses that power, communities need to stand up and say enough is enough. I'm grateful to my neighbors for their support. The reporter thanked me and hurried off to file her story. I walked to my truck, exhausted but satisfied. My phone rang as I was pulling out of the parking lot. Unknown number. "Hello. Is this Jason Yates?" A woman's voice, official sounding. "Yes, who's this?" "Detective Sarah Palmer with Phoenix PD. I'm calling about the investigation into Gerald Peck and the incident with your electrical service. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" "Of course. We've been interviewing Mr. Peck for most of the evening. He's been pretty cooperative, probably hoping for a plea deal. He's given us a lot of information about conversations he had with Brenda Hutchison prior to cutting your power. According to his statement, Mrs. Hutchison held multiple private meetings with him over the past 2 weeks where she expressed frustration that legal channels weren't working fast enough to force you to remove your decorations." My grip tightened on the steering wheel. Did she specifically tell him to cut my power? Not in those exact words, which is what makes this complicated from a criminal prosecution standpoint. But according to Peck, she repeatedly said that something needed to be done, and that direct action might be necessary, and that if your power went out, you couldn't run those lights anymore, could you? He interpreted these statements as instructions, though a defense attorney would argue they were just frustrated venting. What does that mean for charges against Brenda? We're still building the case. We're going to need to interview other board members and search her electronic communications. We've already obtained a warrant for her emails and text messages. If we can establish that she was orchestrating this, we can potentially charge her with conspiracy to commit criminal damage, maybe even as an accessory. But I wanted to give you a heads up that this might take some time to develop. I appreciate that, Detective. One more thing. We understand there was an incident at an HOA meeting tonight where she was removed from her position. That's probably going to make her pretty angry. I'd recommend you stay vigilant. Make sure your security cameras are working and be careful over the next few days. A chill ran down my spine. You think she might retaliate? I've seen people do crazy things when they feel cornered and humiliated. Just be smart. After she hung up, I drove home more slowly than usual, checking my mirrors constantly. When I pulled into my driveway, I did a full walk around my property with a flashlight, checking all the cameras and making sure nothing looked disturbed. Everything seemed fine. My Christmas lights were blazing cheerfully, the music playing from the FM transmitter. I went inside, locked all the doors, and pulled up the camera feeds on my tablet. I set up motion alerts on my phone and tried to relax. The story hit the news hard. By the next morning, it had gone viral on social media. The footage of Brenda storming out of the HOA meeting had been shared thousands of times. News outlets from around the country were picking it up as a feel-good story about standing up to petty tyrants. My house and Christmas display were featured on several national morning shows. People started showing up to see the display in person. By evening, there was actual traffic congestion on my street. Neighbors came out to direct parking. Someone set up a donation box for a local children's charity. By the end of the night, they'd collected over $4,000. The attention was overwhelming but mostly positive. I did a couple of phone interviews with news outlets, always emphasizing that this was about accountability and reasonable governance, not just Christmas lights. Marcus called me on December 17th. "Jason, we need to discuss your legal options. The HOA's insurance company called me. They want to settle before you file a formal lawsuit. They're aware that their former president created massive liability exposure." "What kind of settlement are they talking about?" "Initial offer is $25,000, plus they'll cover your legal fees and guarantee no fines or restrictions on your decorations for as long as you live there. They'll also formally apologize and put new oversight procedures in place for the board." I thought about it. "What do you think I could get if we went to court?" "Hard to say. Maybe more, maybe less. Court is expensive and time-consuming. But you'd have a solid case for emotional distress, harassment, maybe even punitive damages depending on what the criminal investigation turns up about Brenda's involvement." "Let me think about it." That evening, Detective Palmer called again. "Mr. Yates, wanted to update you. We've gone through Brenda Hutchison's phone records and emails. We found several smoking guns. She texted Gerald Peck the night before he cut your power saying, and I quote, 'We need to be creative. If the rules won't stop him, maybe other methods will. Use your imagination.' She also sent him photos of your junction box with the message, 'Interesting how accessible this is.' My heart raced. That's pretty damning." "We think so. We've arrested her and charged her with conspiracy to commit criminal damage to utility infrastructure and solicitation to commit a felony. She's been booked and released on bond with conditions that she have no contact with you or Gerald Peck. Her arraignment is scheduled for next month. What's she looking at in terms of sentencing? If convicted, probably a year or 2 in prison. Maybe probation if she has a good lawyer and no prior record, but she's definitely facing serious consequences." Over the next few days, more details emerged. Local news obtained copies of the text messages through public records requests. They were even worse than Detective Palmer had described. In one exchange, Brenda had written to Gerald, "Jason Yates thinks he can embarrass me and get away with it. He needs to learn that actions have consequences. If his precious lights can't get power, problem solved." Public opinion turned completely against her. Even people who thought HOAs were necessary agreed she'd gone way too far. The HOA's law firm dropped them as a client, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. The new HOA board, elected at a special meeting on December 20th, was composed of reasonable people who immediately set about reforming the organization's practices. Richard Harper was elected president. His first action was to approve a formal settlement with me, $50,000, all legal fees covered, and a guaranteed spot on the Architectural Review Committee to make sure future decisions were made fairly. I accepted the settlement. It wasn't about the money, really. It was about the principle and making sure this didn't happen to someone else. Christmas arrived with my display shining brighter than ever. The neighborhood had embraced it fully. Families made it a tradition to walk by on Christmas Eve. Someone organized a caroling group that sang on my lawn. Dorothy brought me homemade cookies. Kids left thank you drawings tucked into my mailbox. On Christmas morning, I woke up feeling something I hadn't felt since before my divorce. genuine contentment. My phone was full of messages from friends and family, but also from complete strangers thanking me for standing up to bullying and petty tyranny. Gerald Peck's case moved through the system quickly. On January 8th, he pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for testifying against Brenda. He received 18 months probation, 200 hours of community service, and had to pay full restitution for all the damages, including the emergency electrical work and my legal fees. The judge made it clear during sentencing that he was only showing leniency because Gerald had cooperated fully and shown genuine remorse. "Mr. Peck," the judge said, "you allowed yourself to be manipulated into committing a serious crime by someone who abused their position of trust in your community. You're a retired accountant, a person who should understand rules and ethics. What you did was dangerous and could have resulted in serious injury or death if something had gone wrong with that electrical work. You're lucky that Mr. Yates is a forgiving person and that the community has chosen to focus on reforming your HOA rather than seeking maximum punishment against you." Gerald stood there looking decades older than his age, accepting his sentence with quiet dignity. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Brenda's trial was scheduled for March. Her attorney tried to get the charges dismissed, arguing that her text messages were protected speech and that she never explicitly ordered Gerald to cut my power. The prosecutor argued that her messages constituted clear solicitation and conspiracy. The judge sided with the prosecution. In mid-February, facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a very public trial, Brenda accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit criminal damage to utility infrastructure. On March 3rd, she appeared before Judge Maria Gonzalez for sentencing. I attended the hearing, sitting in the gallery. Brenda looked diminished somehow, wearing a conservative gray suit, her auburn hair now showing gray roots. When given the chance to speak before sentencing, she stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, I want to apologize to Mr. Yates and to my community. I allowed my desire to maintain what I saw as neighborhood standards to cloud my judgment. I never intended for things to escalate the way they did. I convinced myself I was protecting property values and quality of life, but I was really just trying to maintain control. I'm ashamed of my actions and I accept full responsibility." It was the first time I'd heard her sound like an actual human being instead of a petty dictator. Judge Gonzalez was not particularly moved. "Mrs. Hutchison, you held a position of trust in your community. People relied on you to be fair and follow the rules. Instead, you engaged in a campaign of harassment and ultimately conspired to commit a serious crime against a homeowner whose only offense was putting up Christmas decorations. You damaged utility infrastructure, which could have had catastrophic consequences. You also cost your HOA tens of thousands of dollars in settlements and legal fees." The judge sentenced her to 18 months in prison, with the possibility of early release after 9 months for good behavior, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay $25,000 in restitution to the HOA for the legal costs they'd incurred. Brenda's face crumpled as the sentence was read. Her husband, a quiet man I'd never seen at any of the HOA meetings, sat in the front row looking devastated. As I left the courthouse, a reporter caught up with me. "Mr. Yates, you feel justice has been served?" I thought carefully before answering. "I think the legal system did its job. Brenda Hutchison committed serious crimes and she's being held accountable. But honestly, I take no joy in seeing her go to prison. This whole situation was so unnecessary. If she'd just been reasonable from the beginning, if she'd been willing to have a conversation instead of issuing threats, none of this would have happened. I hope she gets the help she needs and comes out of this experience a better person. The story gradually faded from the news cycle as other events took over. Life in Saguaro Ridge returned to normal, or a new version of normal anyway. The reformed HOA board worked hard to rebuild trust. They held regular open forums where homeowners could voice concerns. They revised the bylaws to be more specific and less subject to arbitrary interpretation. They established term limits for board members and required annual training on fiduciary duty and fair governance. I became something of an unlikely community leader. People who'd never paid attention to HOA politics before started showing up to meetings. The board invited me to serve on the Architectural Review Committee, where I tried to balance maintaining reasonable standards with respecting individual homeowners' rights to express themselves. My Christmas display became an annual tradition. The second year, several neighbors asked if they could coordinate with me to create a multi-house display. By the third year, 12 houses on my street were participating, each with their own themed section. We raised over $15,000 for charity that year. Dorothy and I became close friends. She told me stories about the neighborhood before Brenda's reign of terror, when the HOA had been a genuinely helpful organization that organized block parties and maintained common areas without hassling homeowners over trivial nonsense. Gerald Peck completed his community service and stayed out of trouble. I ran into him once at a grocery store about a year after his sentencing. He looked at me nervously, like he expected me to make a scene. "Jason," he said quietly, "I just want to say again how sorry I am for everything. I was weak and stupid, and I let Brenda manipulate me into doing something terrible. I appreciate that, Gerald. I hope you're doing okay." I am, actually. Getting arrested was the wake-up call I needed. I've been seeing a therapist, working on understanding why I let someone else control my decisions like that. I resigned from every board and committee I was on, just focusing on my family now. We talked for a few more minutes. He asked about the Christmas display and told me his grandkids loved it. We parted on civil terms, not friends exactly, but not enemies either. Brenda served 11 months before being released on parole. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband moved to Tucson shortly after her release. I hope the change of scenery helped her find some peace. The HOA insurance settlement money, combined with some savings from my engineering job at a local aerospace company, allowed me to make some improvements to my house. I upgraded the landscaping, added solar panels, and built a workshop in my garage where I could tinker with electronics projects. The workshop is where I design the new sequences for my Christmas light display each year, always trying to create something more spectacular than the last. On quiet evenings, I sometimes sit on my front porch and watch the sunset over the desert. Kids ride their bikes past, neighbors walk their dogs, families push strollers. It's a good neighborhood, better now than when I first moved in. The HOA functions the way it's supposed to, helping rather than harassing, facilitating rather than fining. Sometimes people new to the area hear about what happened and ask me about it. I tell them the story, but I try to emphasize the lessons rather than dwell on the drama. Power, even small-scale power like running an HOA, needs checks and balances. People in authority need to be held accountable. Communities work best when members engage actively, rather than passively accepting whatever those in charge decide. And sometimes, standing up for something as simple as Christmas lights can spark broader change that benefits everyone. Marcus, my lawyer friend, occasionally jokes that I should write a book about the experience. Maybe someday I will. For now, I'm content with my quiet life, my annual Christmas display, and the knowledge that I stood up for myself when it mattered. The legal system worked the way it was supposed to. The people who committed crimes were held accountable. The community rallied together to demand better governance. Nobody died, nobody was seriously hurt, and in the end, justice prevailed. Every December, when I start setting up my lights, I think about that morning when I woke up with no power. I remember the anger and frustration, but also the determination to not let bullies win. I remember my neighbors standing with me, supporting me even when it would have been easier to stay silent. I remember learning that ordinary people, standing together, have more power than any petty tyrant. The Christmas display grows a little each year. This past year, I added a 20-foot projection screen that displays animated snowflakes and holiday messages. Kids can text in their own messages to appear on the screen. It's become a neighborhood interactive experience, something that brings people together rather than pushing them apart. Last December, on Christmas Eve, as families gathered on my lawn for the annual caroling event, Richard Harper pulled me aside. "You know, Jason, when you first moved here, I thought you were a little crazy with all these lights, but you did something important. You reminded us all that communities are built on respect and cooperation, not control and fear. Thank you for that." I looked around at the crowd of neighbors, some of whom had become real friends. Kids were playing in my yard, parents were chatting and laughing, someone was passing out hot chocolate. My house blazed with thousands of lights, synchronized to music that filled the cool desert air. "I just put up some Christmas lights," I said. Richard smiled. "You did a lot more than that." Maybe he was right. Or maybe I'd just been stubborn enough to stand my ground when someone tried to push me around, and everything else followed from that. Either way, I was grateful for how things turned out. The experience taught me that home is more than just a house. It's a community, and communities require active participation and vigilance. They require people willing to speak up when something's wrong and work together to fix it. They require holding those in power accountable while also being willing to forgive when people show genuine remorse and try to make things right. 3 years after that morning, when I woke up with no power, Saguaro Ridge is a better place to live. The HOA functions smoothly under reasonable leadership. Property values have actually increased, partly because the neighborhood has developed a reputation as a welcoming, well-managed community. The annual Christmas display has been featured in tourism materials for Phoenix, bringing positive attention to the area. I still live in the same house. I'm dating someone now, a teacher named Rachel Summers who moved into the neighborhood about 6 months ago. She loves the Christmas display even more than I do, and has started helping me plan each year's theme. We're talking about getting married next fall. My ex-wife called me once after seeing the story on the news. She said she was happy I'd found a cause worth fighting for, and admitted that maybe she'd underestimated me during our marriage. We're not getting back together, but we ended the call on good terms, which felt like closure I didn't know I needed. Life moves forward. The neighborhood continues to evolve. New families move in, attracted by the sense of community and reasonable HOA governance. The annual Christmas display has inspired other neighborhoods around Phoenix to create their own elaborate light shows, many of which now coordinate to raise money for various charities. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd just taken down my lights that first week when Brenda demanded it. Would I have avoided all the stress and drama? Would life have been simpler? Probably. But I also wouldn't have discovered the strength of my community, wouldn't have made so many new friends, wouldn't have met Rachel, wouldn't have helped reform a broken system that was making people miserable. Standing up to Brenda wasn't really about Christmas lights. It was about refusing to be bullied, about insisting on fairness and accountability, about recognizing that sometimes doing the right thing is hard but necessary. Those principles matter in every aspect of life, from dealing with HOAs to workplace dynamics to national politics. The key is knowing when to pick your battles and then, when you've picked one, seeing it through with determination and grace. I never wanted to destroy Brenda Hutchison. I just wanted her to stop harassing me and abusing her power. When she escalated to criminal activity, the consequences followed naturally from her own choices. Gerald Peck made a terrible decision under pressure from someone he trusted, and he paid the price, but also showed genuine remorse and changed his behavior. That's all anyone can ask from someone who's made a serious mistake. Brenda took longer to accept responsibility, but even she eventually acknowledged her wrongdoing. The justice system, despite its flaws, worked. The police investigated thoroughly, prosecutors brought appropriate charges, and judges imposed fair sentences that balanced punishment with the possibility of redemption. The civil settlement compensated me for my troubles and forced the HOA to implement reforms. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the whole experience. The honest answer is no. It was stressful and unpleasant at times, but it also taught me important lessons about myself and about how communities function. I learned that I'm capable of standing up for myself even when it's uncomfortable. I learned that most people are fundamentally decent and will support what's right if given the chance. I learned that change is possible when people work together toward common goals. My Christmas lights still shine every December, brighter than ever, a symbol not just of holiday cheer but of ordinary people refusing to be intimidated by petty tyrants. Kids still drive by with their parents, faces pressed against car windows, marveling at the synchronized displays. Donations still flow in for local charities. The neighborhood still comes together for caroling on Christmas Eve. And somewhere, I hope, Brenda Hutchison has found peace and learned from her mistakes. I hope Gerald Peck has rebuilt his life and his self-respect. I hope everyone involved in that strange, intense conflict has moved forward as better versions of themselves. As for me, I'm exactly where I want to be. In a home I love, in a community I helped improve, with people I care about around me. Every night when my Christmas lights come on, I think about how far we've all come from that morning when I woke up in darkness because someone tried to bully me into submission. The lights didn't just come back on in my house that day. They came on in the whole neighborhood, illuminating the truth about power, accountability, and the importance of standing together against injustice. And they'll keep shining, year after year, reminding everyone who sees them that ordinary people can make extraordinary things happen when they refuse to accept unreasonable authority and work together toward positive change.